The family BMW wasn't supposed to be parked across from our Philadelphia townhouse at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. The strange male laughter upstairs wasn't supposed to be there either. After 8 years of marriage, I thought Catherine was the perfect wife, until I caught her in our bed with another man. But the real betrayal? Finding out he was the same abusive ex she'd sworn she'd escaped when she married me. My name is Thomas Mitchell. I'm 48 years old and work as a financial advisor at one of Philadelphia's oldest investment firms. I've always been the practical type, the guy who plans ahead, saves for rainy days, and follows the rules. Maybe that's why I agreed to an arranged marriage in the first place. It seemed logical. I met Catherine through her families. Her uncle and my father were business partners, and they'd been hinting at setting us up for years. When I hit 35 and was still single, the hints became less subtle. "Tommy," my father said over dinner one night, "you're not getting any younger, and the Parkers have a daughter about your age. Catherine, good family, educated, comes from money. You should meet her." I wasn't against the idea. My dating history was nothing to brag about, and I'd reached that age where finding someone seemed more practical than romantic. So I agreed to meet her at a charity gala her family was hosting. Catherine was elegant. That's the first word that comes to mind. Tall, poised, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile. She taught literature at an exclusive private school and had that cultivated air of someone who grew up with privilege. Our first conversation was stiff, both of us obviously there to fulfill family expectations. "So, Thomas," she said, swirling her champagne, "I hear you're quite successful in finance." "I do all right. Nothing exciting, but stable," I replied, already falling into the role of the reliable provider. We saw each other for almost a year before I proposed. It wasn't passionate or spontaneous. I bought the ring my mother suggested, made reservations at the most expensive restaurant in Philadelphia, and asked her to marry me because it seemed like the next logical step. She said yes with the same practicality with which I had asked. The wedding was lavish. Her parents spared no expense. Old money Philadelphia turned out in full force, and we smiled for photographs that would grace the society pages. I remember standing at the altar, watching Catherine walk down the aisle, thinking not about love, but about partnership, about building something solid together. I told myself that love would grow over time, that marriages built on compatibility and mutual goals often lasted longer than those sparked by passion, that we would develop a deeper connection as we build our life together in our Center City townhouse. Looking back, I see now that I was lying to myself. What I couldn't admit then was that there was always something missing, something fundamental. But I ignored that empty feeling, buried it under mortgages and dinner parties and the appearance of success. I became exactly what everyone expected of me, a successful Philadelphia financial advisor with the perfect wife and the perfect life. At least, that's what it looked like from the outside. For 8 years, Catherine and I maintained what looked like a perfect marriage to the outside world. We had the right friends, attended the right social events, and projected an image of success that made my parents beam with pride. Philadelphia's mainline society welcomed us, and we played our parts flawlessly. I worked long hours at the firm, building a client list of wealthy Philadelphians who trusted me with their futures. Catherine thrived at Westfield Academy, where she taught literature to the children of the elite. On weekends, we hosted dinner parties or attended charity galas, always smiling, always cordial. But behind closed doors, our marriage was quiet. Not explosive, not passionate, just there. Like a piece of furniture you stop noticing after it's been in your living room for years. "Thomas, the Hendersons invited us to their lake house next weekend," Catherine would say over breakfast, barely looking up from her tablet. I already said yes. "I hope that works with your schedule." "Sure," I'd reply, knowing that my schedule would accommodate whatever social obligation she'd committed us to. It always did. That was our relationship, cooperative, functional, and utterly devoid of intimacy. I told myself this was normal. That passion fades, and what remains is companionship. Catherine was an excellent hostess, maintained our home beautifully, and never caused scenes. I should have been grateful, right? But there were signs I ignored. How Catherine would stiffen when I touched her. How our conversations never ventured beyond the superficial. How she'd spend hours on the phone with her sister, but barely manage 5 minutes of conversation with me. Do you ever think about having children? I asked one night, breaking our usual pattern of small talk. Catherine looked at me as if I'd suggested we move to Mars. At our age, that ship has sailed, Thomas. Besides, I have my students. That's quite enough for me. I didn't push it. I never pushed anything with Catherine. I was too afraid of disturbing the delicate balance we'd established. Too afraid of acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, I'd made a mistake. So I threw myself into work, stayed late at the office, took on more clients than I needed. I joined the board of a local charity, spent weekends golfing with colleagues. Anything to fill the space where a real marriage should have been. Friends would comment on how lucky I was. Catherine is so elegant, they'd say. You two are perfect together. And I'd nod and smile, wondering if they could see through the facade or if I was the only one who felt the emptiness. Looking back, I realize now that we were both playing parts in a production neither of us had the courage to end. Catherine had her reasons for staying, and I had mine. Pride, fear, obligation, they're powerful motivators. They can keep you trapped in a life that looks perfect on paper, but feels hollow in reality. If only I'd been brave enough to admit the truth sooner. It might have saved us both from what came next. They say the truth always finds a way to surface. For me, it happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I'd come home early from work after a client canceled our meeting. The townhouse was quiet when I entered, but I could hear Catherine's voice coming from upstairs. She was on the phone in our bedroom, the door partially open. I was about to announce my presence when something in her tone made me pause. She sounded different, animated, authentic in a way she rarely was with me. I know, Beth. Trust me. I know, Catherine was saying to her sister. If I could go back and do it all over again, I would never choose him again. Thomas was convenient, safe. But God, the boredom of it all. I froze in the hallway, my briefcase suddenly heavy in my hand. My wife's words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to lean against the wall to steady myself. You don't understand what it's like, she continued, unaware of my presence. Living with someone who's just there, like furniture. He doesn't challenge me, doesn't excite me. He's exactly what Mom and Dad wanted for me. Stable, respectable, financially secure. But I feel like I'm slowly dying inside. I overheard my wife say, I would never choose him again, and in that moment, everything I thought I knew about our marriage crystallized into a painful truth. The careful illusion I'd built shattered around me. I should have confronted her then and there. I should have pushed open that door and demanded an explanation. Instead, I quietly retreated downstairs, set my briefcase down, and then made a show of entering the house noisily, keys jangling, door closing firmly, calling out her name. By the time I made it back upstairs, Catherine had ended her call. She greeted me with the same polite smile she always wore, like a mask she had perfected over the years. You're home early, she observed, not a trace of the conversation I'd overheard in her voice. Client canceled, I replied, studying her face and wondering how many other conversations like that one had happened over the years. How many times she had expressed her regret to others while maintaining this perfect facade with me. That night, as we went through our usual evening routine, the polite dinner conversation, the news program on TV, the scheduled intimacy that felt more like an obligation than desire, I saw everything differently. Each interaction felt hollow, each smile forced, each touch mechanical. I couldn't sleep. I lay awake watching Catherine's back rise and fall with her breathing, wondering if she had ever loved me at all. Had our entire marriage been a charade? Had I been the only one trying to believe in this arrangement? The next morning, I went through the motions of getting ready for work, my mind still replaying those devastating words. I would never choose him again. They echoed in my head during my commute, during meetings, while I advised clients on their financial futures while my own personal investment was crumbling. I spent the next few weeks observing Catherine through new eyes. I noticed how she would check her phone when she thought I wasn't looking, how her rare laughter was never directed at anything I said, how she maintained a careful physical distance between us at all times. Had these signs always been there, and I'd simply refused to see them? I thought about confronting her, but what would be the point? She had made her feelings clear, even if she hadn't meant for me to hear them. And deep down, a part of me knew that what she'd said was true for both of us. If I were truly honest with myself, would I choose Catherine again? The answer scared me more than her words had. 2 weeks after overhearing Catherine's confession, I left work early. My boss had noticed my distraction and suggested I take the afternoon off, unprecedented in my 8 years at the firm. I arrived home around 2 p.m., surprised to see an unfamiliar BMW parked across the street. The house was quiet when I entered, except for Catherine's laugh drifting from upstairs, a genuine laugh I'd rarely heard directed at me. I climbed the stairs, pausing outside our partially open bedroom door. The sounds coming from inside confirmed my worst suspicions. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. Catherine was in our bed with Dr. Richard Harmon, the Dean of Humanities at her academy. They were so engrossed in each other that they didn't notice me immediately. Something primal took over. I lunged forward, grabbing Harmon by his shoulder and yanking him away. "What the hell?" I shouted, my voice unrecognizable. Harmon stumbled backward, naked and startled. "Thomas, wait," he started. My fist connected with his jaw before I realized I'd thrown a punch. He fell back against the dresser, knocking over Catherine's perfume bottles. "Get out of my house," I roared. He scrambled for his clothes and fled downstairs without resistance. Catherine wrapped herself in our duvet, her expression transforming from shock to indignation. "How dare you barge in here like this? How dare you assault Richard?" I almost laughed. "How dare I? This is my home, Catherine. You had no right to embarrass me like that," she hissed. That's when it hit me. She wasn't upset about being caught. She was upset about being embarrassed, about potential damage to her reputation. "How long?" I asked, suddenly weary. She looked away. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." 2 years, she finally said. "But it's not what you think. Richard and I have a connection that you and I never had." 2 years. Half our marriage a lie. I looked at this stranger I'd pledged my life to. "I'm done," I said quietly. "I deserve better than this." I turned and walked out, ignoring her calls. I drove aimlessly for hours before checking into a downtown hotel. From my window, I stared at the Philadelphia skyline, city lights blurring through unshed tears. For the first time in years, I felt something beyond numbness. Pain, yes, but also something else. Something that felt strangely like relief. I woke up disoriented in the hotel room, momentarily forgetting why I wasn't at home. Then it all came rushing back. Catherine, Harmon, the look on her face. Not shame, but annoyance at being caught. 8 years of marriage, and I never truly knew her. I ordered breakfast I couldn't eat and checked my phone. 6 missed calls from Catherine, 3 text messages asking where I was. None apologizing, none acknowledging what she'd done. Typical. Outside, Philadelphia continued as if nothing had changed. The morning sun reflected off glass skyscrapers. Businessmen hurried along with coffee cups. Tourists gathered around Independence Hall. My world had imploded, but the city didn't notice or care. I called my assistant to let her know I wouldn't be in. For the first time in my career, I took a personal day without a compelling reason prepared in advance. Then I called James Wilson, a lawyer friend who specialized in divorce. "Thomas Mitchell," he greeted me. "Twice in 1 month. The firm must be booming." "It's personal this time," I said, my voice strangely steady. "I need to discuss divorce options." Silence on the line. "I'm sorry to hear that. Come by at noon. I'll clear my schedule." I showered and changed into yesterday's clothes, feeling oddly detached. In James's office, the reality began to sink in as I outlined what had happened. "Pennsylvania is a no-fault state," James explained, "but given the circumstances, we have options. Catherine's infidelity could factor into property division." I nodded mechanically as he outlined next steps, timeline, financial considerations. The dismantling of a life together reduced to legal procedures and asset allocation. "This isn't what you planned," James said gently when he finished. "None of us go into marriage expecting it to end." I looked out his window at the city sprawling below. The problem was exactly that. I planned everything. The right school, the right career, the right wife, and the right family. I never once asked myself what I actually wanted. "And now?" James asked. "Now I don't know," I admitted. "For the first time in my life, I don't have a 5-year plan." Later, I checked into a different hotel, unwilling to return to our townhouse yet. I sat on the bed with a scotch from the minibar, analyzing my marriage with the same clinical detachment I applied to investment portfolios. All the signs had been there. Catherine's emotional distance, our lack of genuine connection, the way she performed the role of wife rather than truly being one. I'd ignore the red flags, convincing myself that stability was enough, that passion was overrated. But the hardest truth to face was my own complicity. I'd chosen safety over authenticity, appearances over connection. I'd been so busy playing the part of successful husband that I'd forgotten to be an actual partner. The realization was both painful and liberating. The marriage I mourned had never really existed except in the story I told myself. And now, at 48, I had the terrifying opportunity to figure out what I actually wanted from life. What would make me genuinely happy, not just what would look good on paper. I fell asleep that night with no answers, but for the first time in years, real questions. A week after moving into a temporary apartment, I returned to our townhouse to collect more of my belongings. Catherine had texted that she would be at school, giving me space to pack without confrontation. As I boxed up my books and clothes, curiosity got the better of me. I opened Catherine's laptop. Her password was still our anniversary date, a detail that now seemed tragically ironic. I wasn't proud of snooping, but I needed answers. Her email revealed a relationship with Harmon spanning not just 2 years, but almost 4, half our marriage. Their exchanges were filled with passionate declarations and intimate details that Catherine had never shared with me. But what stopped me cold was discovering that Harmon wasn't just any colleague. He was Catherine's ex-boyfriend from graduate school, the same man she had described as controlling and emotionally abusive when we first met. The man she claimed to be relieved to have escaped. I remembered how she described him. Richard could be charming when he wanted something, but he'd turn cold and manipulative if I didn't conform to his expectations. The irony didn't escape me. She had painted him as the villain in her past, while I was cast as a rescuer. When my lawyer called that afternoon, I shared my discovery. So she went back to her allegedly abusive ex. James mused. Not uncommon, unfortunately. People often return to familiar patterns, even destructive ones. She told me she'd never go back to someone like him. I said that she'd learned her lesson. People lie, Thomas, to others and to themselves. I thought about the Catherine I thought I knew. Poised, intelligent, independent. Had any of it been real? Or was our entire marriage just a safe harbor while she waited for Harmon's change? That evening, a mutual friend called to check on me. Emily had been Catherine's friend first, but had grown closer to me over the years. I feel stupid, I admitted to her. Everyone probably knew except me. Not everyone, Emily said gently, but some suspected. Richard has a reputation at the school. Catherine isn't his first entanglement with a married colleague. The next day, I met with a therapist James had recommended. Dr. Levine listened without judgment as I unpacked 8 years of delusion. It sounds like you're questioning not just your marriage, but your identity, she observed. I define myself as a husband, a provider, I acknowledged. I never stopped to ask if I was happy. And now I'm starting over at 48. I looked out her office window at Philadelphia's skyline. It's terrifying. It's also an opportunity, she countered. To build a life based on what you want, not what's expected of you. I nodded, understanding intellectually, but not yet feeling it emotionally. The betrayal still felt like a physical wound, but beneath the pain, something else was emerging, a reluctant recognition that this ending might also be a beginning. 3 months after discovering Catherine's affair, I sat in James's office, signing the final divorce papers. Pennsylvania's no-fault divorce had moved surprisingly quickly, accelerated by Catherine's unwillingness to contest any terms. She kept the townhouse. I took my retirement accounts. Clean, clinical, final. Congratulations, James said, sliding the paperwork into a folder. You're officially divorced. I didn't feel like celebrating. Instead, I felt an odd emptiness. Not grief exactly, but the strange disorientation of stepping away from a role I played for so long. What now? I asked, more to myself than to James. That's entirely up to you, he replied. For the first time in years, perhaps. Outside his office, Philadelphia was in full spring bloom. Cherry blossoms lined Rittenhouse Square, and people lounged on benches enjoying the warm afternoon. I walked aimlessly, trying to absorb my new reality. My phone buzzed with a text from Emily. Heard today was the day. Drinks later if you need to talk. or celebrate. I smiled despite myself. In the chaos of divorce, unexpected friendships had emerged. Emily had chosen my side when most of our social circle gravitated toward Catherine and her compelling narrative of an emotionally distant husband. Thanks. Maybe next week, I replied. Tonight, I needed solitude. Back in my new apartment, smaller than our townhouse, but with better natural light, I poured a scotch and stepped onto the balcony. The city sprawled before me, full of possibilities I hadn't considered in years. My therapist had suggested I reconnect with old passions, so I dug out my cameras from storage. Before finance, before Catherine, photography had been my first love. I'd abandoned it as impractical under my father's guidance. Now, at 48, I was rediscovering the joy of capturing light and shadow. The freedom felt terrifying, but exhilarating. No more society obligations. No more maintaining appearances for Catherine's colleagues. No more suppressing my own interests to accommodate her preferences. I'd learned that Catherine had moved in with Harmon almost immediately after our separation. According to mutual friends, they were already discussing marriage. The news had stung at first, but now I found I could wish her well without bitterness. Whatever game she was playing, with him, with herself, it was no longer my concern. My phone buzzed again. My mother this time. Your father and I are worried. Call us. I silenced the phone. They never understood why I'd thrown away a perfectly good marriage. They didn't want to understand. Their disappointment was no longer my burden to carry. For the first time in my adult life, I answered only to myself. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but tonight, I would savor the simple, profound pleasure of making choices solely for myself. 6 months after my divorce, I'd established a new rhythm to life. Weekdays were devoted to my finance career, which I'd scaled back to reasonable hours. Evenings and weekends became mine again, for photography workshops, hiking the Wissahickon trails, and reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during my marriage. I was having dinner with Emily at a new restaurant in Old City when she hesitated over her wine glass. Have you heard about Catherine? I paused, fork halfway to my mouth. No. Should I have? Emily shifted uncomfortably. There's been talk at the school. Richard, Dr. Harmon, has been placed on administrative leave. Something about inappropriate behavior with a graduate assistant. I set down my fork, absorbing this information. And Catherine? She's standing by him publicly, defending him to the board. But Jen from the English department says she's barely holding it together. Apparently, it's not the first time since they've been together. I nodded, feeling a complex mix of emotions. A hint of vindication quickly replaced by genuine concern. History repeating itself. I murmured, "What do you mean?" When we first met, Catherine told me Richard was controlling and emotionally manipulative. I was the safe alternative. I swirled my wine. I guess she thought he'd changed. Emily's expression softened. People rarely do. Later that week, I ran into Catherine's sister Beth at Rittenhouse Square. She looked surprised to see me, then guilty, as if caught in an indiscretion. "Thomas," she said, composing herself. "You look well." "Thanks, Beth. You too." I meant it. Unlike Catherine, Beth had always been authentically herself, the wild sister who traveled the world and spoke her mind. She glanced around nervously. "I don't know if you've heard about Kathy." "Some of it," I admitted. "Is she okay?" Beth's expression clouded. "Not really. Richard's, well, he's showing his true colors again. The same patterns as before, only worse. She's lost weight, barely sleeping." She hesitated. "He monitors her phone, her emails. Gets angry if she sees friends without him." I felt a pang of genuine sympathy. Whatever Catherine had done, she didn't deserve that. "Tell her," I started, then reconsidered. "Just take care of her, Beth." She nodded gratefully. "I'm trying. She's stubborn, you know that. Won't admit she made a mistake." I thought about pride and the prisons we build for ourselves. How Catherine had gone from one cage to another of her own making. Walking home, I reflected on how differently our paths had diverged. While I was finding new freedom and joy, Catherine had traded a stable but empty marriage for a passionate but destructive relationship. I felt no schadenfreude, only a quiet gratitude for my own healing and growth, and hope that someday Catherine would find hers too. A year after my divorce, Life had found a new equilibrium. I'd been promoted at work, but negotiated reasonable hours as part of the deal. My photography hobby had evolved into a small side business, with 2 local galleries featuring my Philadelphia cityscapes. I'd even started dating occasionally. Nothing serious, but enjoyable connections that reminded me I wasn't defined by my failed marriage. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months. Catherine. We need to talk. Please. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond or whether to respond at all. Before I could decide, another text arrived. I made a terrible mistake, Thomas. I see that now. A knot formed in my stomach. After a year of healing, of building a new life, Catherine's sudden reappearance felt like a threat to my hard-won peace. I set the phone down without replying and went for a long walk along the Schuylkill River Trail, trying to clear my head. By morning, 3 more messages had arrived. I know I don't deserve your time. Richard and I are over. For real this time. I missed the stability we had. I took it for granted. I showed the text to Emily over coffee. What do you think she wants? Emily raised an eyebrow. Seriously? She's realized the grass wasn't greener after all. Richard showed his true colors, and now she's looking for a safe harbor again. I'm not that harbor anymore, I said, surprised by the firmness in my voice. Are you going to respond? I considered it. I don't know. Part of me thinks I should just foreclosure. Another part thinks responding only opens a door better left closed. The text continued over the next week. Increasingly desperate appeals for conversation, for understanding, for second chance. I maintained my silence, focusing instead on preparing for my upcoming photography exhibition. Then came a handwritten letter to my apartment. Catherine always did appreciate the personal touch of pen on paper. I know I hurt you unforgivably, she wrote. I betrayed your trust and our vows. But our marriage had a foundation of respect and stability that I've only now come to truly value. Richard was a mistake, a toxic, dangerous mistake that I'm finally free from. I'm in therapy now, working to understand why sabotage something good for something destructive. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I'm asking for a conversation, one meeting to apologize properly for the pain I caused. I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer. Part of me felt sympathy for Catherine. Another part recognized the subtle manipulation in her words, the implied flattery that our marriage had been good, when we both knew it had been hollow at its core. My therapist had a simple question when I brought it up. What would seeing Catherine add to your life right now? The answer was equally simple. Nothing. I had moved on. My life had direction and purpose that had nothing to do with Catherine or our failed marriage. Whatever closure she sought would have to come from within herself, not from me. I never replied to her messages. 2 years after my divorce, I stood in a small gallery in Old City, surrounded by my photographs and people who had come see them. My second exhibition had drawn twice the crowd of the first, with several pieces already marked with small red sold dots. This is incredible, Thomas, Emily said, handing me a glass of champagne. You should be proud. I was proud, not just of the exhibition, but of the journey that had brought me here. At 50, I had created a life that felt authentically mine for perhaps the first time. I still worked in finance, but on my terms, 4 days a week, with the 5th dedicated to photography. I had genuine friendships, a comfortable apartment overlooking the park, and a quiet confidence that had replaced my need for others' approval. Thomas Mitchell, a voice behind me said, I always knew you had an artist hiding inside that banker's suit. I turned to find Beth, Catherine's sister, examining one of my cityscapes. Beth, this is a surprise. I hadn't seen her since our encounter in Rittenhouse Square a year earlier. I hope it's okay that I came. I saw the announcement in the paper and... She gestured to my photographs. These are truly beautiful. Thank you. How are you? How's Catherine? I asked, genuinely interested but no longer invested. I'm good. Catherine's getting there. She moved to Boston last month, teaching at a small college, living alone, working with a good therapist. Beth smiled sadly. She wanted me to tell you she's sorry if I ever saw you, and that she understands why you never responded to her messages. I nodded, appreciating the closure, but not needing it. I wish her well, Beth. I really do. I know you do. She squeezed my arm. You're a good man, Thomas. After Beth left, I circulated through the gallery, discussing my work with interested patrons. Later, A small group of us, friends I'd made in the past 2 years, continued the celebration at a nearby restaurant. Looking around the table at these people who knew the real me, not the facade I'd maintained during my marriage, I felt a profound gratitude. The pain of Catherine's betrayal had forced me to confront the emptiness of the life I'd been living and find the courage to build something authentic. I thought about the lesson I'd learned. That love, real love, can't thrive where there isn't honesty. Catherine and I had both been performing roles rather than sharing our true selves. We had created a marriage based on appearances and expectations rather than genuine connection. Now, at 50, I'd learned to value authenticity over perfection, depth over approval. I'd learned that starting over, while terrifying, can lead to places you never imagined. And most importantly, I'd learned that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, to choose a life that resonates with your truest self. For that painful awakening, I could only be grateful.